This is Dateline News and Conversation. Oh, my guest tonight, a good friend, a very important person. He's a professor of law. He's an author. He's been to Russia several times and been to the Donbass. He's been to Crimea. Professor Dan Kovalik. Dan, welcome back to the show.
Regis, thanks so much for having me. Great to see you again. Yeah, the last time we saw each other, we were in Crimea. And
Correct.
Of course, where you live, a beautiful place.
Well, you know, all the talk this last week in circles that is not focused on the American election, and I don't want to talk about that at all, was the BRICS meeting in Kazan, Russia last week. A lot of people around the world are talking about it. It was, in my opinion, a historic meeting. I've been reading those kinds of headlines in alternative media, but I would like to ask you your opinion on the significance of the BRICS movement and the significance going forward from this meeting in Kazan, Russia, where Russia, for this past year, has been the head, has taken the lead on the movement. So what's your opinion on it? What's your take?
Well, I think, first of all, it's a very good development, a very necessary development. It represents a majority of the world's population, the countries that are part of BRICS. For that reason alone, it has to be taken very seriously. Even the Secretary General of the United Nations showed up to the Kazan meeting, much to the chagrin of the West, of course. Look, this was the BRICS movement has been necessitated by the dominance of the West, and in particular the United States, over the world economy, and the dominance of the US dollar, which has allowed the US to sanction about 1/3 of the world's population, and to do so effectively, to prevent countries from being able to trade freely, from being able to get the food and medicine they need, from being able to get the parts they need for their industries. They've really wrecked entire economies, like in Venezuela and Cuba and North Korea and many more. And of course, the big target was Russia. After this special military operations began, the U.S. imposed an incredible round of sanctions against Russia, which has cut Russia totally off from the West. In a way, I don't think they've ever been cut off from, even when they were the Soviet Union. And so these countries had to come together to find an alternative to a system which the U.S. dominated and did so in a way to hurt other countries. And so the BRICS are going to create their own trading system and financial system that will free countries from this dominance by the West. And I think I saw something like 150 plus countries are applying to be part of that new BRICS system. And there's only 190 plus countries in the world. So if they all join that, that'd be a vast majority of countries in the world. So it's a very exciting thing, I think, because the U.S., since the collapse of the Soviet Union, has had this hegemonic power over the world, and it has misused it in such gross ways to wage war, to suppress other people, and the BRICS, I do think, is the hope to end that dominance.
Yeah. There were some 20,000 delegates, it's been reported, that were in Kazan, and 36 countries were represented there, not all members yet. I think that is really significant. Already, the countries that are part of it and are joining and want to join represent the majority of the population of the entire planet. And I'm not an economist, but apparently their GDP is larger now than the G7. So I think I mean, they must be getting a wake-up call in the West, and I'll ask you that question in a little bit. One of the first things that they declared, and I'm looking at it right now in their document, I've downloaded it and I've studied it extensively. They said, we reaffirm our commitment to multilateralism and upholding the international law, you're a lawyer, including the purposes and principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations as its indispensable cornerstone and the central role of the United Nations in the international system. They're demanding more participation of the global South, Africa, South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. What are your thoughts, Dan, as an attorney, in terms of the demands they're making for a reform of the United Nations? Do you think it's possible?
Yes, well, that's a great question. First of all, we have to recognize, and I think you and I agree, that the United Nations system is broken, and it's been broken on purpose by the United States in particular, that wanted to break it because it decided it was the most powerful country in the world and that it was not going to be bound by international law. Everyone else could be, but not the United States. And so it has gone out of its way to really destroy all the institutions of the UN that govern international law, including the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice. So first of all, we have to start with the premise that, yeah, the UN system is broken, international law is broken. And so the question is, you pose, can we change that? Can we rebuild what has been broken within the framework that exists now, the United Nations? I think the answer certainly is yes, if there is a will to do so. If the United States in particular decided it wanted to do that and wanted to play a productive role to do that. Otherwise, I don't see how it's possible, because right now the UN was designed after World War II to give the Allied powers at that time control over the UN through the Security Council. The UN Security Council is the only body in the UN that really has any power. It can order economic sanctions. It can even order military measures to be taken. But you have 5 countries with veto power, and those are the allied countries: the United States, China, Great Britain, France, and it was the Soviet Union, now Russia. And the problem you have is that the U.S. vetoes any measures to hold countries like Israel accountable for what they're doing in Gaza, for the genocide in Gaza, to hold accountable itself, the United States, for all of the aggressive wars it is involved in. It uses its veto power in a very self-serving way. So unless the U.S. is willing to participate in reforms, for example, that would limit those veto powers, that would expand the Security Council and the permanent members of the Security Council beyond those 5 countries. There's a lot of proposals made that would allow the Security Council to be, free from the veto of any one country. Unless the U.S. is willing to do that, it can't be reformed. And I certainly don't see the U.S., neither one of these presidential candidates would be involved in that type of reform. I can't see in the near to midterm future that the U.S. would be willing to do it. So if they're not, it can't be done. And therefore, there will have to be an alternative system created. And again, it may be BRICS that does that. They may be the ones to create an alternative system.
Well, that's a good analysis, and I agree that I don't think the United States will ever agree to be just one among equals
Right.
in the world. I don't think that's going to happen. Now, here are these countries, some 36 now that are either about to join it or who showed up in Kazan. It's very well known. They have been creating a new economic structure. They've been creating a new World Bank, a development bank. They've been already, many of them, trading with their own currencies already right now. And I can tell you for a fact, Russia has been working very aggressively, not really behind the scenes, it's out in the open, to create this system that will bypass the dollar, that will leave it behind. I have a couple of questions, but the first one is, Dan, do you think whoever it is who's in power in the United States, and I think we both agree it's neither the Democrats, the Republicans, Trump, or Kamala Harris, do you think that they're aware? I think they are, but do you think that they're aware of this movement and what it represents? I mean, a threat to their dominance in terms of the world economy. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I think they have to be aware of it. And I think that is why you see this increasing military aggression by the U.S. I mean, the U.S. is threatening, major wars on at least 3 different fronts, right? Expanding the war in Ukraine against Russia, of course, supporting this really big war in the Middle East, and of course, threatening China. The U.S. could go to war in any and maybe all of those theaters. And I think the reason there are folks in the ruling class who want those wars is because they see that is the only way to prevent the U.S. dominance from declining. We can no longer outcompete China economically. I think the ruling class has accepted that. I think they see that we cannot destroy Russia with sanctions, as they hope that they might be able to. And now they see that Israel in West Asia seems unable to defeat Hezbollah, Iran, and even Hamas. So their grand plans are being foiled. They know this, but I think they see war as the solution, a big war, which will allow them to come back on top. It's a twisted, sick idea, to make war for those types of reasons. But I do think that the people in control of the White House now, and as you say, it's not Biden, it's not Kamala Harris. I think it's unelected neocons like Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan. I think that they want war, and they want war because to accomplish what they can't accomplish through other means.
I made a film in 2013. It's called 30 Seconds to Midnight, Doomsday. And at the end of that film, I posed the question, will these neocons, or whoever they are in power in the United States, recognizing they've lost this epic battle for the future control and order of the world, take us all down in a nuclear Armageddon? People are already talking about this, Dan. World War III, which everybody knows, and they've been gaslighting us about it, is going to be nuclear. It is not going to be a conventional war. I wonder what you think about that. Do you think, now you've mentioned that their response and their only tool is war. Do you think these people are willing to risk nuclear war? The people they're playing with, Russia's vastly superior to the United States in weapon technology, nuclear technology, their hypersonic missiles. You've got China, that's a nuclear country. You've got North Korea, that is nuclear, and they feel more threatened probably than anybody else that they might be the next target. Do you think that this is a possibility? Are they that crazy, or I want to add, evil, to think that they can win and will use a nuclear war?
I do think so. And I think that there's been leaders in the U.S. who have been willing to do that for a long time. First of all, let's remember the U.S. has been the only country to use nuclear weapons. In this case, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, at the end of World War II. We know that General MacArthur had suggested using a nuclear weapon against China during the Korean War. We know that in the 1960s, the Pentagon did war games in which they decided that the U.S. could win a nuclear war even if it meant losing about half the U.S. population, but that was seen as a viable option. And by the way, a loss that those folks were willing to sustain. So we've seen over time that the U.S. has been populated by leaders, as you say, crazy enough, evil enough to get us involved in a nuclear war. Of course, the movie Dr. Strangelove, which is a comedy and it's a fiction, is based on these real people that had these, very dangerous tendencies. And yes, I think right now there are folks in the leadership in the United States willing to use nuclear arms. And in fact, I'll tell you, there was an interesting article in the Huffington Post, I don't know when this was, a year or two ago, in which someone wrote an op-ed saying, well, limited nuclear war might be good for global warming because it could cool, nuclear war would lead to a nuclear winter and cool down the world. This is like a liberal commentator writing this. So, I mean, there's a lot of people who seem willing to use nuclear weapons. Even there was this bizarre public service announcement in New York City about a year or so ago, which was about nuclear war. Oh, if there's a nuclear attack, go down into the subways and use those as your bunkers. And they kind of gave, these very, brief steps that you should take if there's a warning of a nuclear attack. And at the end, the woman on this public service announcement said, New Yorkers, you got this. Like, nobody's got this. No one's going to get this, but that's how deranged people are, that they think we could survive this. And here's the problem, Regis. The other question is, there's the great joke from the show The Lone Ranger. The joke where the Lone Ranger is looking over the hill at a huge group of Comanche Indians, and he turns to Tonto and he says, Tonto, I think we're in trouble. And Tonto looks at the Lone Ranger and says, who's we, Kimusabi? So you have to ask, who's we? I think there are people in the ruling class. I know there are people in the ruling class who think they don't need any of us, think they will survive no matter what happens. And the rest of us be damned, right? I mean, and we know they're building bunkers. We know that they have these space stations and this idea that maybe they're going to live in space. what's this guy? The guy that runs X.
Elon Musk.
Elon Musk. He has an idea for this a solar powered giant plane that even has a swimming pool that can circle the Earth for like 5 years without landing. All of these ideas that they are getting away. This was, by the way, never even a possible thought till recently, right? So the fact that the ruling class had to live with us prevented them from doing the worst. Now they don't think they even have to live with us. And again, another example of this I thought was during the lockdowns of COVID, you had those 3 rich guys go to outer space, right? I think Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson, I think Elon Musk too. It kind of almost showing us, guys, we're out of here. You know, you may have to stay in your homes, but we can just go into space, right? So when you have that mindset, and when these are the people running the planet, then all of us are expendable. And that's a very scary thought, Regis. But I do think that that is what's happening here. I do think that is why there's a cavalier attitude among some in regards to nuclear war.
Yeah, I have to agree with you, Dan. I do think that some of these people believe that they are exceptional,
Right.
that we are dispensable. In fact, you know, Obama said it. We're the one true, only dispensable nation, indispensable nation. That means everybody else, you know, you can go to hell. I mean, they don't care. And I think when you look at what's happening in the world today, that's pretty obvious. You know, I think one thing that I found very interesting, and I don't think it was highly reported, even in the alt media, this whole discussion about the United States pondering whether or not to allow itself and UK to fire their long-range missiles deep into Russia. The Pentagon opposed it. And I think that was significant because I think those people who fight wars know that they can't win this one. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, again, most level-headed people think that we can't win this war. Obviously, Ukraine cannot win this war. But again, I think there are some who think that with a greater intervention by NATO, with, you know, more weaponry, more powerful long-range weaponry, that if the war can't be won, and by the way, I don't know if the goal is to win the war, right? Isn't it the Orwell line from 1984? The war wasn't meant to be won; it was meant to be continuous. Or, you know, I certainly think they could keep this war going for a long time. And what does that do? It enriches the defense industry, and it continues to sap Russia of its resources and its people. Right? I mean, there's no doubt Russia has weathered this very well. But the longer the war goes on, excuse me, the more Russia will have to expend to defend itself. And if it starts getting hit by long-range missiles that are being promised to Ukraine, then it will even be, you know, subject to greater pressure. And that's what they want to do. They want to destroy Russia. And you know, if this war keeps going, certainly they could weaken Russia. There's no doubt about that. So again, I think certainly the people who are in charge of the U.S. right now want this war to continue as long as possible, and will do anything to make that happen. And again, that's very scary. It's very scary for the people of Ukraine. It's scary for the people of Russia, and again, for the rest of the world, because that really could lead to nuclear war. And Putin has said that. I mean, Putin has said it, I believe, in desperation, saying, look, if you keep pushing us, we will have to defend ourselves, and we'll have to do it with nuclear weapons, you know, but that doesn't seem to deter the West from continuing on in this escapade.
You know, two things are significant, I think. Putin, yesterday or the day before, ordered a nuclear exercise of their entire nuclear triad. It's like, whoa. Now, he sent a number of strong messages to the West, but I thought this one is particularly strong, where, all right, they're on trigger alert, and now they're doing exercises. The other thing that I found significant was J.D. Vance. Now, he and Trump are not in the White House, at least not yet, but when he was asked about our enemies, he said, I'd rather consider them adversaries and competitors. And I thought that was an interesting change in terms of how, at least he is defining those three countries, really, the United States, China, well, those two countries, as America's main enemies. He's saying now adversaries and competitors. I think this changes the way some people are seeing it anyway, at least whoever was behind J.D. Vance being able to say something like that. What are your thoughts?
No, absolutely. There are divisions in the ruling class on this, right? There are more sane heads on this issue that I hope will prevail to prevent us from going over the brink. And you see a large, if you see polls in the U.S., actually very few Americans see Russia as an enemy. It's a very low number, very low percentage of Americans, despite all the propaganda. Most Americans don't see Russia as an enemy, right? And I think a huge swath of the Republican Party base does not want war with Russia, does not want this war in Ukraine. I think the Democratic Party has their base is more belligerent towards Russia for sure. They drank the Russiagate Kool-Aid a long time ago. But it is interesting how the Republican Party base really seems to be against these wars. And Donald Trump at least pays lip service to that. If he's elected, will he, listen to those folks? I don't know. But at least there's some hope, again, because, when it's mentioned, Trump says something at these rallies about opposing these wars, he gets huge cheers from the audience. It's very strange. I mean, the Republican Party used to be more the party of war than the Democrats, and now it's kind of flipped. So we'll see, but there is hope. There is hope, Regis.
We're talking about enemies of the United States. I really find that disingenuous. The last time the United States was invaded by another country was the War of 1812 against England. We've never been threatened militarily by anybody in all of those years. And the United States has always used the term enemy.
Right.
Now, what's really clear, Russia, the country of Russia, not the Soviet Union, has never threatened to attack the United States. China has never threatened to attack the United States militarily. Nobody, maybe only Kim Jong-un in North Korea has threatened to blow up the United States.
And not seriously, but yeah.
So really what it is, the United States has considered any country to change its dominance in the world, its hegemony, and to challenge the United States' interest in other countries, which is to steal their resources and their land. This is one of the reasons why, and we talked about earlier, that I do not think the United States will be able to change that ideology or that doctrine of defending its supremacy throughout the world. What are your thoughts?
Yes, well, I agree with you. This idea of enemy, and let's again take Russia, which seems to be enemy number one right now. What makes Russia an enemy of the U.S.? What has Russia done to the United States? Nothing. Russia under Vladimir Putin helped the U.S. in the war on terror. President Putin was the first international leader to call George W. Bush, offer him help, offer first his condolences for what happened on 9/11, offered to help in the war on terror and did so. Russia has done nothing but extend the olive branch and offer cooperation. In fact, Russia wanted to be part of the West, wanted to be part of the EU, wanted to be part of NATO. And you know, it's the West that said no to Russia, not the other way around. So again, the idea that Russia's an enemy is ridiculous. The same thing with China. I mean, again, China has not itself even been at war since 1979. And they don't go to war. It's a peaceful nation. They don't threaten the United States. Obviously, they are a major, part of the U.S. economy. They supply the U.S. with billions of dollars of goods, which Americans like because they're cheaper. And many U.S. companies, of course, operate out of China, including Apple, for example. So again, what makes China an enemy in that circumstance? Nothing. The U.S. has enemies of choice. It chooses who its enemies are, not the other way around. It chooses what war it wants to fight. It's not forced into war. It goes to war because it wants to, and invariably not out of self-defense, but in order to, again, engage in wars of conquest. Even after 9/11, instead of going after Al-Qaeda, the U.S. went after countries that were mortal enemies of Al-Qaeda, like Iraq under Saddam Hussein, right? Like Libya. Gaddafi was a mortal enemy, not only of Al-Qaeda, but even Wahhabism, which is the ideological, inspiration for Al-Qaeda. And of course, then the U.S. ended up assisting Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other groups, so all of this is just a pack of lies, Regis. I mean, that we've been sold. The U.S. has told us who our enemies and friends are, and frankly, it tends to be the opposite of what we're being told.
Yeah, I had my epiphany sometime around 2011, and my undergraduate degree was in United States history, and it was only around 2011, 2012 that I had this wake-up call. And then I began studying the real untold history of the United States from a variety of sources. And what I have come to understand is that the United States is nothing more than white European colonialism that existed for 300 or 400 years before they even found the United States. And ever since these white European colonialists came to the United States, it's been about genocide of the Native American people in North, Central, and South America, hundreds of millions probably just all eliminated, and what remains are on reservations. And so it's been the stealing of land and resources,
right.
Manifest destiny, the idea that, the rest of the world now is even ours. And the reason for the war in Ukraine is not just to weaken Russia. Lindsey Graham came right out and said it a couple of weeks ago. There's trillions of dollars of resources under the ground in Ukraine. And when you look at any other country, the Middle East, it's oil.
Right. Natural gas. Yeah.
Yeah. And when you look at Russia, for example, is not an economic threat to the United States. It never has been. When you look at China, China is the economic threat. I believe they've already surpassed the United States. I don't know what numbers people want to use, but this is why the United States now has shifted its attention and calls China the primary enemy. So I don't think they can ever get over this. It's in our DNA. I don't want to say ours, but those people who are controlling the whole mess, it's in their DNA to want to steal land and resources from wherever to increase their wealth and to increase their power. But I want to shift the discussion now, Dan, to something else. I have a very good friend. He's not an American, he's a European. He's very well educated. He's an economist. He says he has a great deal of hope for the BRICS movement. But because of some of the elements in the declaration and part of the movement, he's concerned that maybe they're part of the globalist agenda for 2030. Couple of things specifically. They fully embraced the World Health Organization. They're fully embracing, accepting, using the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, which they say need to be reformed a bit, but they're embracing it. Your thoughts, Dan, on whether you think the globalists are part of the movement or whether the movement is embracing some of the globalist agenda?
Yeah, well, it's clear that they are embracing some of the globalist agenda, which is too bad. I mean, the problem with the BRICS are that, that all, my old time commie friends always remind me, Russia's the leader of the BRICS, and Russia is Russia. It's not the Soviet Union anymore, so there isn't a real ideological component to the BRICS, except kind of, again, being in opposition to the West. But it doesn't really have, for example, a socialist alternative to the West, or even any kind of true alternative to it. Or at least not one that deviates from many of the Western assumptions about the world. And that's its shortcoming. And therefore, it's not surprising that it therefore would embrace some of these globalist things as well, right? Because it's not, again, as an ideological project, it really is not a great variance with the West or the dominant system. And that's a shortcoming of it. But that's by the nature of the countries that are part of it. China obviously is, at least declares itself to be a socialist country. It has socialist aspects, but, it certainly also has hyper-capitalism, and so in the end, I do think that it is a capitalist movement, and one of the reasons, I guess I was seeing that Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, they thought they were shoo-ins to be admitted to BRICS, and they weren't. Because Brazil, I guess, vetoed them. But also, I think people didn't like what Maduro said at the BRICS about Palestine and really opposing what was happening in Gaza in his strongly worded languages he gave. And by the way, the BRICS statement declaration on Palestine is not real strong. So again, I think while I support the BRICS, I see a lot of hope in the BRICS. I'm not naive about what the BRICS is, right? It has its limitations. And it'll only change if those countries themselves develop in different directions, right? So, but the good part about it, I mean, just to say one good thing about it, is that at least it's creating a cooperative system, even to the point where you have countries like India and China that have been mortal enemies for centuries, now resolving ancient border disputes as a consequence of getting together through BRICS, right? You have Vietnam and China, also mortal enemies, coming together in BRICS. So that's the positive thing. They're trying to build a world that is less conflictive and more cooperative. And to that extent, I'm all for it. But as I said, on an ideological level, it has its limitations. Let's just say that.
Yeah, and I think this is a very interesting point. I do think BRICS is an evolving alternative to what has been the U.S. Western predator capitalist system. I don't think there's any doubt in my mind that where BRICS is going is a different form of capitalism.
Right.
With the emphasis on the sovereignty of all countries, all nations, equality, regardless of the size of a country. It is a one among equals in this new emerging world order. They talk about mutual development, the development of all countries. It's that principle of the rising tide raises all boats. This is very different than the American predator or Western predator capitalism, but I think it still is an emerging different form, which is based on equality, one amongst equals, and the sovereignty of all nations. What are your thoughts?
No, I agree. I think that's a very good way to put it. I think in many ways it is as you say, honestly, that sounds like the United Nations, which was built on the idea of a community of equals, right? Even if you were the tiniest country, you were supposed to be as equal as a giant country. Again, that never materialized, but at least that's embodied in the UN Charter. So BRICS, I think, reflects that spirit. I think there's a very anti-colonial nature to it, you know. In fact, it reminds me a little of the non-aligned movement, which I guess still exists on paper. I don't know. Maybe they even still meet, but which had its heyday in the 60s and 70s, which was an anti-colonial movement. And this kind of feels like that as well. Yes, I agree. I think it aspires to be a more humane form of capitalist of capitalism, and to that extent, it's an improvement. Look, in this world, I'll take any improvement we have, and that would be an improvement. And again, a form of capitalism that did not depend so much on war. I think that is a big priority of the BRICS. You know, so it represents a better alternative for sure to what we're seeing now.
Yeah, I loved the way you described it, an anti-colonial movement. When you think about it, almost all of those countries have been colonialized.
Yes,
almost all of them, and I think this is a very important point. And I hadn't really thought about it like that, but it really is an anti-colonial movement. And, you know, when the United States looks at this, and we talked about this in the beginning, they just can't accept that they could be one among equals in this
right.
new emerging order. They are dyed-in-the-wool colonialists, and they have it's Western colonialism on steroids, because now the entire world is America's oyster.
Right.
It's not just one region, or it's the entire freaking world. Anyway,
And space as well, by the way, space as well, even beyond the world. Right.
well, exactly. And, you know, I made a film, The Ghost of Jeju, back in 2011, where for the first time in my life, I became aware of the United States agenda. It was for 2030 2020 or 2025 was full spectrum dominance on the land, the seas, the air, and in space. And Dan, what we can see now, there is a space race.
Yes.
And there are weapons in space. I know there are now anti-satellite weapons that Russia and China and the United States have all tested. Who knows who else might be able to do that? And the big concern is whether or not they will put nuclear power and nuclear weapons in space. I have one last question for you because it has everything to do with war. Electromagnetic pulses that the United States has the ability, China, Russia have it, that some say the next war will not be a conventional war. One country or another will be the first to use electromagnetic pulses to knock out an entire electrical grid, for example, in the United States, where everything goes dark, your street lights, your credit card, everything is just gone.
Your computer, your phones, yes.
Everything.
Yeah.
To me, and I'd like your thought on this before we finish, I don't so much fear a nuclear war as a next step, but I would fear that the United States might use this electromagnetic pulse to try to knock out both China and Russia, and not even using missile technology. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think, first of all, I'll be totally honest. I have not given this a lot of thought till you just asked me it, but I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. And the U.S. talks about this, and the U.S. is preparing to defend itself against this sort of thing, but I think is also, as you say, preparing to use it against these other countries. I have no doubt that that's a real possibility. And by the way, I'm sure there's weapons out there we don't even know what they are that could be intended to use. Iran just announced it had these weapons that were more powerful than nuclear weapons. I'm not even sure what they are. The point is, we don't even know what's out there. And that's what's scary. I think everything's up for grabs. And I fear that, we've just expended so much of our brilliance as human beings into weapons of mass destruction, right? It's heartbreaking. But one of these days they're going to use those weapons in a big way, and that's my big fear as well.
Yeah, since the first primitive humans began quarreling with literally sticks and stones over the centuries, we've improved our weaponry to the extent where today the weapons we have are capable of destroying all of humanity.
Yes.
I want to go back and finish on one point. You mentioned in the beginning the statement in the BRICS declaration about the genocide ongoing now in Palestine was really kind of bland. I'm looking at it right now. We reiterate our grave concern at the deterioration of the situation and humanitarian crisis in the occupied Palestinian territory. One thing that I've had a hard time understanding, how, first of all, the other Muslim Arab countries have not come to the defense of their brothers and sisters.
No.
But why do you think the rest of the world, powerful countries, have not entered into this conflict one way or another? China certainly has an interest. Russia certainly has an interest. India has an interest. I mean, so many countries have a vested interest in maintaining peace there, and it's not just about oil. What are your thoughts going forward, Dan?
I think there's a number of reasons. I think Israel's nuclear weapons is one deterrent. I think people fear that. They fear that if Israel's cornered, that they would use those weapons, which is probably a real concern. I think also countries like Russia and China, to their credit, are very reluctant to go to war, very reluctant to be the first to start a war. I think may see that region is not within their sphere of influence, or at least not enough, again, for them to militarily get involved. I also think that, again, they do have a certain respect for the international law system. They did try to pass resolutions at the Security Council that might have led to a more robust opposition to what Israel is doing, that might have even included a military intervention. Of course, the U.S. vetoed all those. And I'm not excusing the lack of intervention, because I think that needs to happen. I'm certainly not excusing the Arab countries, which are completely, for the most part, giving up their dignity in kowtowing to Israel and the United States. I mean, which is just terrible. But I'm trying to explain it, and those are some of the reasons I think that we haven't seen a more robust opposition to what's happening in Gaza. But I would just say, I think one has to happen. I think if there was ever a justification for humanitarian intervention, this is it. Someone needs to step in and stop this.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think it's most disturbing to me to watch the relentless, unrestricted violence that Israel has been inflicting, not only on the Palestine and Gaza, but Lebanon, and killing the leaders of other countries in Iran and Iraq and Libya, in Syria. The world has never seen anything as violent as this.
No.
And when I look at it, Dan, I can only describe it, and all of this that's threatening humanity, as evil personified.
Yes.
I don't know your final thoughts, Dan.
No, I've seen people describe it as satanic, and I don't think they're too far off. I mean, I'm watching very closely what's happening in Gaza, and the images I'm seeing are just heartbreaking. Absolutely heartbreaking. Babies are being killed. Children are being shot in the head, assassinated. Children. They say it might take 350 years to rebuild Gaza. I mean, they've destroyed a people and a civilization there. I mean, it goes back to what you said. This is just nothing but old-time white settler colonialism. This is the type of genocide we saw in the Americas, right? After Christopher Columbus. This is nothing but an extension of that. And it is completely heartbreaking. And I think a lot of us really are emotionally traumatized by this, and we should be. And the fact that my tax dollars are going towards this is just completely unacceptable to me. And I just want this to end, and I want the people of Palestine to survive. And I fear that the Palestinians in Gaza, by and large, will not. And that's just a terrible thought.
Dan, I want to thank you so much for joining me tonight. It's really great to see you again. We're going to have to do it and not wait so long.
Great. Regis, I enjoyed it. I'd like to do this again. I'd like to see you in Crimea again as well.
Oh, you're welcome anytime.
Thank you. Thank you very much.